Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. It's been a few weeks. I hope you missed me. I was away on a trip with some friends and I've just been doing life things. So I hope it's okay that I kind of come back to you with this unscripted take. I know some of the feedback I've gotten is about being a little bit more polished with some of my research, but today I wanted to kind of go against the algorithmic gods. So before we get into it, go ahead and subscribe, hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads from me. I try to upload every week. I was on a pretty good streak for a while, but I'm trying not to hold myself from week to week necessarily just because life happens. And let's get into it. So I recently finished a book called Hungerstone by Kat Dunn, and I'll put a picture somewhere up on the screen. We're going to read some quotes today, and it got me thinking about something I have been ruminating on for a while now, and I think this is going to be a really good introductory exploration with you guys about what might pique your interest in this subject. But I think there's a lot of potential here to discuss the Gothic novel, how it relates to women, how vampires play into the mix, and how this ladders up into femininity and horror as a whole and as a genre, and how it's been kind of split into different categories. So let me get started, I guess, on the bigger umbrella concept and conversation around horror in general. Now, obviously, modern horror has different elements depending on what type, right? You have typical slashers like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. You have all of those, and obviously those have a trope now. They were popularized largely in the 80s and go along with a certain pattern, involve torture, involve a lot of jump scares, just have a very formulaic component to them, which a lot of horror does, right? A lot of horror is formulaic. Horror is tapping into our biggest fears in order to teach us something about ourselves or release something about ourselves, right? I think that is something we can comfortably say is paramount and just a cornerstone of the horror genre in general. But there are some key differences. I would say, thrillers are part of horror. They are obviously more intense. They thrive and build on suspense. They count you becoming very invested and, the whole sympathetic response, right? They want your nervous system wrecked. They want your blood pressure up. They want you compelled. They want you yearning and just wanting a conclusion and wanting a resolution, right? To whatever's happening in the moment. So that's one area of horror, obviously. We think of more modern horror movies, and there is this sense of a monster. There's this sense that there is something lurking, something gone wrong, and that you have to confront that. Now, I always lean a little bit into some of the subgenres of this, which is like psychological horror, right? Where it's less about what is actually out there in the world, and it's more about, is this part of your brain? Is it really happening? What is real and what is not? And to me, that segues and has an interesting through line into, Gothic horror. Because in particular, I think there is a resurgence right now happening with Gothic horror and by proxy, I think vampire media in general. And I think it's really interesting to have Hungerstone, the novel, as a conversation point around this. Because there is male gaze and female gaze, and just follow me here for a second. But male gaze and female gaze obviously have very different drivers and different pointers and different requirements in order to meet the stereotype of a gaze, right? And this is very common with male gaze in terms of looking at a woman. You want her scantily clad. She's typically blonde or brunette. She has lashes and nails and her hair done and wears different clothing that would invite and entice the male attention. Now, this obviously differs when you look into the female gaze, because typically a lot of female gaze is less about sexuality and it more leans into authenticity of a woman, her sovereignty, her autonomy, and honestly, her expression. And it is not dependent on the sexuality of a man or the approval of a man. So that's a very high level male and female gaze. And I think the same can be turned when it comes to horror. Because when we think of typical horror, you think of this monster, you think of, I haven't seen these movies, but I think of like the Terrifier movies where there's just a lot of torture. I think of House of a Thousand Corpses. I think of this like visceral, just really gory, macabre body horror. There's obviously lines, there's obviously a lot of overlap in terms of genres, but I'm kind of talking broad strokes here. There's a lot of things that I think like male gaze horror like glorifies. You know, there is this sense of like torture. There's this sense of like, you think of House of Wax, you know, those are the ones that I think of where there isn't necessarily a conclusion. There isn't necessarily a happy ending, obviously. And it's rooted a lot in violence. I think female gaze horror is less that. And I would be so bold to say that I think a lot of female gaze horror is rooted in Gothic horror because it is this sense of an underlying dread. And there isn't something so obvious on the surface. There's always something underneath that is brimming, that is rising to a boil, that is culminating into some kind of giant event or like a climax or something. A few good examples of this are, obviously Gothic horror has been popularized in the 1790s, I believe. We're going to take a look at this New York Public Library brief history of Gothic horror, which I will put the link in the description. And like I said, this is like brief and it's a little bit of a digest since it is a very quick note of it. Gothic fiction as a genre was first established with the publication of Horace Walpole's dark foreboding, The Castle of Otranto, in 1764. In the centuries since, Gothic fiction has not only flourished, but also branched off into many popular subgenres. Early novels in the Gothic horror subgenre heavily feature discussions of morality, philosophy, and religion, with the evil villains most often acting as metaphors for some sort of human temptation the hero must overcome. The novel's endings are more often than not unhappy, and romance is never the focus. The battle between humanity and unnatural forces of evil, sometimes man-made, sometimes supernatural, within an oppressive, inescapable, and bleak landscape is considered to be the true trademark of a Gothic horror novel. These are the core elements that separate Gothic horror from its cousin, Gothic romance. In 1818, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's debut novel, Frankenstein, marked a shift in Gothic horror by changing the typical Gothic villain from an evil man or supernatural creature into a physical embodiment of human folly, brought to life through the power of science. Edgar Allan Poe managed to condense elements of Gothic horror within his short stories, starting in 1839 with the release of The Fall of the House of Usher. So although it is really about Gothic castles, crumbling medieval ruins, so prevalent in early novels, many modern Gothic novels have moved away from this traditional setting towards more contemporary locations, such as the haunted house featured in Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, or the Bramford apartment building in E.R. Levin's Rosemary's Baby. As long as the environment invokes a disturbing sense of unease and or terror within the reader, then anywhere is a fair game in a Gothic horror novel. I think that's an interesting crossover, right? Because there's this obvious element, like I said, of dread, and I think it lends itself really well to, female gaze in general for a lot of reasons. And like they said, there's a lot of blurred lines between a Gothic horror novel and Gothic romance because there is this sense of the macabre, the mysterious, the dreadful can blend into romance. This one does make some bold claims, which I may or may not agree with everything in there. But I think the point of exploring that and reading that is novels from women, I think, are very prevalent in Gothic romance and in Gothic horror in this blurry blend together. Because you think of things like Jane Eyre, you think of things like Carmilla, and particularly Hungerstone, I think, combines these and transmogrifies these elements and these pieces of inspiration into something that truly encapsulates a really nice Gothic romance / Gothic horror novel that isn't really done well today. And trust me, I have read a lot of Gothic novels over the last few years, just trying to find and get that fix, get that sense of melancholy, that sense of dread, that sense of terror. And it's difficult to find because people want hard-hitting, visceral torture. They want these very hard-hitting cornerstones of horror that typically people think of, right? You think of, the Chucky movies, which don't get me wrong. I think, Bride of Chucky and The Seed of Chucky are some of the best queer representations in horror in the last 30 years for sure. But it's not Gothic. And this is what we're talking about really from the perspective of a female gaze. Oftentimes, it was mentioned in that New York Public Library excerpt, Gothic horror is often about something inside of yourself that's trying to come out of you, or it's an element or a metaphor for something dark. There's just this foreboding darkness that's surrounding you. And I think it just lends itself really well, especially with people who feel very resonant with melancholy feelings or depression or just generally the dark things in life. And it's something I've always really related to. I think back when I read Jane Eyre in college, I had no idea it was really labeled or perceived as a Gothic novel, but it's not always a castle. It can be a newer house. It can be something that takes on a life of its own. I think Haunting of Hill House, not the TV show, guys. The TV show is beautiful in its own right, and I think it is one of the best depictions of grief and just general dread that has been in modern TV and like modern storytelling that I've seen myself. But in this context, I want to like stick to the novel and how it's become adapted into modern books and media. But the house is almost its own character. The environment that these people are in kind of shape their reality and vice versa. And going to Hungerstone, I was just so blown away, and it reminded me of all of these pieces put together and how well that female gaze, sapphic romance lends itself so well to the Gothic romance and or, horror genre. Because in this one specifically, Hungerstone by Kat Dunn is a retelling of Carmilla. And Carmilla predates Dracula by, I believe, at least 20 years, if not more, about a lesbian vampire. And the metaphor in this one was she was so used to, the woman condition of pleasing everybody else and putting herself last that she didn't even know what she wanted anymore. And it created this hunger inside of her. And Carmilla was a catalyst, and she functioned so well in this book as not only something to awaken Lenore's sexuality, but her own autonomy and her sense of thirst and hunger. Particularly what the book is named after is they see a riverbank, I believe, that the water is low, and they call them hunger stones because when you pick them out of the stream when the stream is low, people used to mark the stones so that they would know if the water was lower than normal over a season. And I thought that was just such, again, a good tie, using the environment around them to augment and contextualize what was happening in Lenore's inner world so well. Gothic novels, again, like there is this sense of the self, but also how the environment around them is almost a character and how they react to it. There was this back and forth with the house that they were at. I think it's Nethershore. She had a British accent, so I'm sorry, I didn't see the words typed, but I'll put the word up on the screen here. But the house that they were in was run down, and she was tasked with the difficult objective of, bringing this house back to life. But there was this ongoing battle where the house was almost battling her. Everything was run down. There was this sense of dust and decay all around her. But as the story went on, I think she came to have an understanding with the house that it, despite all odds, was still surviving and persevering through difficult situations, i.e., the weather and difficult seasons. And what better way to describe a woman who, back in that time period couldn't conceive a child. And that's the sense of dread, right? That she'd been building this lack of desire being fulfilled for most of her life. And she tucked away her grief inside of herself. When she was younger, she was in a carriage with her parents, and they had a horrible accident and her parents died, and she had blood all over her from her parents. And it was something she buried deep in herself, but the grief came out in other ways. It came out in this, hunger and this sense of doing what everybody else wanted because she thought that that would make her happy. It's so relatable, again, from like a woman's perspective. The Gothic novel, to me, is hard to get right nowadays. I've read a few of them that just didn't quite hit the mark. And it's so nice to just walk away from something and feel this book hangover. And I would say this is the first book I've read in a little while that's given me that. I felt like it was just really good to talk about how Gothic romance and Gothic horror lends itself so well to and parallels the female experience for much of the time that it became popularized, right, into the Victorian era, even into, what is considered more modern in Haunting of Hill House. There's this sense of feeling trapped. Lenore felt so trapped in her life in multiple ways, with a husband who she was constantly seeking his approval and his love, and he instead was kind of a scam artist and a crook and just never prioritized her well-being, which isn't that quite common, right? Especially since even to this day, women still take on a lot of emotional labor. They take on a lot of mental labor to caretake or keep up with the house or do domestic chores that really, when you take away all the biases or stereotypes of what gendered person should do, guys should do this or women should do that, there really is no logic in it. Either person could very well do this. But there's this sense of entitlement with men because they had a patriarchal structure that obviously prioritized them. And what a great way to explore that from a woman who found out and unearthed her sexuality and her attraction for another woman. Because what better way to say screw you to the patriarchy than a sapphic couple? Because it basically emasculates a man. It makes him useless, right? If two women are together, which is why I think it's always been trivialized. I mean, look at the meme of, oh, they were roommates, like even to this day in art history books, she was with her friend in bed together with their tops off. Gee, I wonder what they were doing. Lenore being this complex character and Kat Dunn making the intentional choice to write the book as well in a first-person present tense, which, if you don't read a lot of books, it's not a very common tense to write in. I think first person in recent 5 to 10 years, has become more popular. It wasn't, I think, like 20 years ago. I think it was third person was very popular to write in terms of, like, I'm talking about just general fiction, like the very big bucket that fiction is. I think with romantasy books and book talk and all of this, I think first person, just because people resonate and self-insert a lot, especially in fan fiction, that becomes books and book deals and all of that. I think first person has been popularized a lot, which at first I'm neutral about first person. I think as long as it's done well and there's a purpose and an intention set with writing first person, it can be done really well. And I never felt like, especially in the audiobook, that it was not done well, because there is a little bit of timey-wimey where she jumps back into the past, because going to this house, and again, like this decrepit house, which is almost a metaphor for her, barren womb, right? Because she couldn't give Henry a son or a child. It was kind of just creeping in on her, but it became an ally to her almost in the end, because she was able to take her power back in her own way in the house and because of the house. So that's my love for Gothic novels. If you enjoy sapphic books, which if you're on my page, why wouldn't you enjoy sapphic books? I highly recommend this one. I am still thinking about it days after finishing it, and I believe Kat Dunn is British. She did a lot of research in her author's note about this book, looked into a lot of archives about the area, made some authors, modifications, as you do, to tell a story more effectively. But in terms of the sense of dread, I think a lot of people just want a payoff and they want the monster to be seen, right? They want this reveal. Often, I think in things like Jane Eyre, a lot of it can be kind of mirroring what a narrative that you've been telling yourself all along, and like that can be the biggest horror of it all, and that can be the biggest melancholy of it all. But I find that such an insightful exercise to have with yourself of, am I prioritizing myself, and I don't want to cost my own expression and sense of self for a partner or for another person. And that is not easy to go against the grain, because there's like so many TikTok trends, right, of, oh, I fell in love with a guy now and I like pink, like I was just watching a drama queen video where she was talking about this. And sapphic novels, at least this sapphic novel, I really loved that Carmilla didn't just spoon feed Lenore what she needed to discover about herself. She acted as this mysterious but direct force and example for her to see there are different ways of being a woman and being yourself, and that doesn't always fit into the norm, and you're misdirecting your hunger toward what you really want, and you're doing it at your own expense, if that makes sense. She was, again, sacrificing her own well-being for everybody else, and in the book there's a plot device that illustrates that really well, but I'm not going to give like any major spoilers in this, because I think it's really nice to spread the word about this book, and just in general, the vehicles and the methodology of a Gothic novel, and how there's this, again, the creeping sense of like vines grow gradually, right? You don't always see it, but over time it can create this huge wall. And that's a really good, metaphor for how Gothic novels can grow on you, and how dread can be such an effective, I want to say device, but an effective method to help paint a character and to help mount pressure and up the ante without creating these wild, out-of-pocket scenarios. At first, Lenore had this, my parents died, like the Bruce Wayne, like my parents are dead and so now I'm bereft of anything. But I will give it credit, over time, you really got to get in her head and understand why that hunger had grown and developed like it did. And it was never overtly vampiric, which is interesting because, again, I say it's Carmilla, but there was this sense of seductiveness and sexual awakening in Lenore too that was just really satisfying to read. And not just because this was not erotic, I would say, in any way. Like, the sex scenes are fairly short. I think there's only one or two, and each of them are very differently written for obvious plot device reasons. But I did feel like it created a really good juxtaposition between how it felt for Lenore to be with a man versus be with a woman. And I'll leave it at that. What a great way to bottle all of these things together. The lesbian, the sapphic, the Gothic, all together, because I think they're complementary flavors. I watched way too much of the Great British Baking Show lately, and you think of how they always pair like passion fruit with something really soft like vanilla or mango. The acidity of one complements the sweetness of the other so they don't overpower each other. And that's a great analogy for how I felt after reading this book. It was like such a nice little pastry that you got to nibble up and eat. What a delight it was. I saw this at Powell's in Portland, Oregon. Wasn't sure. I put it on my TBR, which, by the way, quick PSA, please support your local libraries right now. If you don't have access or the means to go to a physical location, you can download the Libby app, the Hoopla app, and the Canopy app. Libby and Hoopla give you access to check out books digitally, and I think you can get a library card online fairly easily as well, at least in the States. And Canopy gives you credits every month where you can watch like new movies. I think they have a lot of A24 movies and they rotate their catalog pretty regularly. I do enjoy going on there once in a while and watching it, and just using these resources that are at your fingertips determines whether you'll want to buy something. Because if you're anything like me, I'm obviously a book lover. I majored in literature. I read books as young as I can remember. I got the book at pizzas. I loved it growing up, and I've always loved fiction. It signals to libraries that they need funding and that they are deserving, but it sends a signal of data and validation that they deserve the funding in order to keep functioning to help the public. And if you think about it, libraries are one of the few places where you can exist without spending money. So let's keep supporting them. Let's uplift them. That's my little PSA, my side note PSA about libraries. But anyhow, I ranted a lot in general about the Gothic novel. I want to read to you a few quotes from this novel that might crystallize a little bit more of what I'm talking about. To be a woman is a horror I can little comprehend. I learned quickly that my wants and needs were unwelcome, too great for any reasonable person to fulfill. And in time, I came to agree with her. I was too much, too loud, too emotional, too clumsy, too self-involved. My existence was a burden to all involved with it, and I resolved to never make any demand if I could help it. I do not need to contain my appetites. What is a monster but a creature of agency? Just those few paint such an interesting picture because we have epigenetics, right? We inherit traits from our DNA, from our ancestors, from our parents, different traits. I think for women in particular, we are often rewarded for being meek, for not being assertive, for not speaking out our wants and our needs, because that was never important societally. We played a role, we were often seen as property, and to be monstrous in the lens of being a woman is to go outside of that, demand more. And that's why there has been so much pushback even now and in the past 100, 200 years with voting and with just general women's rights and bodily autonomy. So these themes, I think, are really potent right now and charged politically and otherwise. And it's a reason I think you can't say that nothing's political, but that's a whole nother topic. In terms of feminine rage in the Gothic novel, again, it's such a great way to tell it while still staying in the confines of what is womanly and what is okay. And it creates this really compelling dramatization when women finally step out of that in those novels. This struggle of the self and of hunger and of wanting more and realizing that she deserved more made it a very compelling novel to read, and it made it satisfying because the length of it wasn't too long, but it still built and developed in a very organic way. And the interactions between her and Carmela felt very organic, and it was this nice flow. And again, no spoilers, but I do feel like you guys know if you read Sapphic books how things typically end. It does not do that, so don't worry about that. So that's my pontification on the Gothic novel and how I think Sapphic vampirism really plays into this nicely. I don't think, like I said, it was too on the nose. Carmela was compared a lot to, being cat-like, being very nimble, this sense of, again, like hunger, but using it as a device of, awakening very valid and authentic rage in the woman experience and the feminine experience. And there was just something really compelling about it not being too on the nose. But I'm really excited because I've seen some TikToks about, vampire media coming back and kind of being a parallel. You know how we've seen recession pop? There's like this parallel between vampire media being popularized again because, as we all know, vampires hundreds of years ago represented the nobility because there is this sense of like they suck dry the land, right? There's this sense of they're a disease, they're a plague upon the land, and there's something to be feared. and they overpower and they have strength and they thirst constantly and they can never be sated. Their appetite can never be quenched. I'm very interested to see like this new uptick and revival in vampire media, and who knows, I may or may not write my own. I did have a chapbook a few years ago that I was working on that I might be tempted to release it on. What media do you guys consume writing on nowadays? I've thought about Substack. I've also just thought about having a general personal blog, but I would love to get some general feedback on stuff if I am, once I do get to writing again, because again, this book has been in my head rent-free since I finished it. Let me know if you've read the book, what you think. What is your opinion on the Gothic novel? Do you feel like it is suited really well for, the female gaze? Is that a little myopic? Is it both? I don't think it's exclusively just female gaze, but I think it lends itself really well to a lot of themes in the female experience and in a woman's experience of feeling trapped and feeling bereft or melancholy or like you're being changed. So like I said, would love for you to subscribe to my channel. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'm going to keep poking around on here. If you want me to do, other kind of movie reviews, I did one for I Saw the TV Glow. If you saw that movie, I have that on my channel. I think reviews don't always perform really well, so I don't think that'll be the bulk of the videos that I do on my channel. But so like I said, thanks for tuning in, and I will talk with you guys later. Bye.